All right, so, we've done some pretty deep dives on this show, but today's source material might just take the cake. I mean, we're talking about a transcript of a YouTube video documenting a hypnotic regression session.
Yeah, you could say that again. Not exactly your typical peer-reviewed journal article, but hey, that's what makes this so intriguing, right? We're about to get a glimpse into the subconscious of a guy named Nestor, guided by a hypnotherapist named Calogero Grifasi.
And from what I've gathered, Nestor is dealing with some pretty heavy stuff, feeling stuck, lacking confidence under constant pressure. And get this, he even recalls a past life experience where he believes he was captured and implanted with something.
Exactly, and that's where our deep dive begins. We're going to try to unpack these key experiences and revelations from Nestor's regression, understand the core themes, and see what might be relevant for you listening in.
So let's lay it all out. We're going to be exploring everything from Nestor's feelings of being influenced by some external force. He even mentions the possibility of esoteric or implant-related influences to his strong sense of being a prisoner, to those detailed past life memories of a planetary conflict that ultimately led to his capture.
And we can't forget about that vivid memory he has of a painful implantation.
Yeah.
His struggles with astral travel, the sensation of some kind of ongoing external interference, even some family dynamics that came up during the session. Buckle up, folks. This is going to be a wild ride.
To kick things off, why don't we start with what drove Nestor to seek out this hypnotic regression in the first place? What was he hoping to achieve?
Right from the get-go, Nestor's main goal was crystal clear. He wanted to break free from what he felt was holding him back. He used this phrase, "get out of where I am now." And it wasn't just a vague sense of dissatisfaction. He felt genuinely trapped, like something was preventing him from moving forward.
Yeah, and he wasn't just talking about feeling stuck in a rut. He specifically felt that external forces, maybe even esoteric or implant-related influences, were at play. It's like he suspected there was something beyond his conscious control that was keeping him down.
Right. And this wasn't just a one-time feeling either. He described this recurring pattern of trying to improve his life,
Yeah.
searching for a new job, pursuing personal goals, and always ending up back in the same negative situations.
Yeah.
It's like he was caught in the loop.
Like he was on a hamster wheel, running and running, but never getting anywhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just external factors. He also recognized some internal challenges he was grappling with. For one, he felt immense pressure, which he linked back to his father's high expectations and this lingering sense of being enslaved that he attributed to a past life.
So even if he didn't fully believe in past lives on a conscious level, it sounds like that feeling of being trapped and controlled carried over into his present life in a very real way.
Absolutely. He mentioned that any situation where he felt pressured or someone was demanding something of him would trigger that deep-seated feeling of enslavement. It's fascinating how these past experiences or even just deeply held beliefs can shape how we experience the present.
No doubt. And aside from the pressure, he also identified a major lack of confidence as a huge obstacle. He even mentioned being a designer, but despite his talents, he just couldn't seem to believe in himself or feel prepared to seize opportunities. It's like classic imposter syndrome, but amplified by these other layers of feeling stuck and under pressure.
Right, and he even questioned, where is the limit, expressing this real frustration with his own self-doubt. So alongside these present-day challenges, he also brought up some really fascinating past life recollections.
Yeah, these memories seemed incredibly real and vivid for him. He talked about a past existence where he had something he called planetary consciousness, and this kind of advanced knowledge, almost like he was once more connected to something larger than himself.
It's definitely a fascinating concept. It suggests a sense of broader awareness and understanding, perhaps a feeling of interconnectedness with a planetary being, or even access to knowledge that's now lost. That feeling of lost knowledge could definitely contribute to a sense of being limited in the present.
And this wasn't a peaceful time in this past life either. He remembered a war raging between different races fighting for control of the planet. Sounds intense.
Oh, absolutely. A major conflict with huge consequences. And here's where things take a really interesting turn. Nestor recalled willingly surrendering himself during this war, even though others advised against it. The reason behind this decision remains a mystery for him, something he's clearly still trying to understand.
Yeah, you can really sense his frustration at not knowing why he made that choice in his past life. It's like this act of surrender plays a central role in his current feelings of being stuck. And then he goes on to describe a fragmented memory of what happened after his capture.
He remembers being taken aboard a craft that he described as saucer, like a very common image in these sorts of recollections. And while his memory of the inside of the craft and the beings involved is a bit hazy, there's one very distinct and disturbing sensation that stands out.
The implantation.
Exactly. He recalled a painful implantation happening somewhere in his groin area. And what's really interesting is that the intense pain associated with this memory was initially suppressed during his recollection, but then it resurfaced under hypnosis.
It's really telling about how our minds can work to protect us from traumatic experiences, even if those experiences happen in a past life. Now, aside from those past life memories, Nestor also mentioned experiences with astral travel, which, for those who don't know, is the idea of your consciousness separating from your physical body.
Yes, astral projection is another name for it. And Nestor had both spontaneous experiences where it just happened naturally, and also times when he tried to initiate it intentionally, but ran into some serious roadblocks.
So it wasn't like he couldn't astral project at all. It's more like something was interfering with his attempts to do it consciously.
Precisely. He described his initial attempts at voluntary astral projection as unsuccessful. And during one of these attempts, he even encountered a being who discouraged him with the word Turu. He didn't see this being clearly, but he heard it speak. And that word Turu is pretty strange, right?
Yeah, it's hard to say what it means exactly, but it's clear that Nestor took it as a warning, like he was being told to back off. That definitely adds to the whole sense of him being controlled or manipulated.
And it seems this encounter really affected his later attempts at astral travel. He noted that they became much harder than his spontaneous experiences.
Yeah.
He even described a time when he physically felt unable to pass through the walls of his room in his astral body, like he was hitting some kind of barrier.
Wow, so this wasn't just a lack of skill or technique. He genuinely felt like something was physically preventing his astral body from moving freely. It adds another layer to this whole feeling of being confined or restricted.
For sure. And to make things even more interesting, he mentioned a real contrast in his experiences, depending on where he was. He found astral projection much easier when he was sleeping in unfamiliar environments, specifically mentioning France.
So it wasn't just him, it was something about his usual environment that seemed to be hindering his astral travel. Makes you wonder what that could be.
It really does. And on top of all of that, he also described some pretty unsettling physical sensations that he interpreted as a form of deliberate interference.
This is where things start to get really creepy. He talked about feeling like he was being grabbed or even choked, especially when he was in the astral state. He saw these experiences as attempts to intimidate him, which just strengthened his belief that something external was messing with him.
Right, and naturally he connected these experiences back to the possibility of implants, wondering if these devices were causing these sensations and contributing to his struggles in his current life. So with all of this in mind, the hypnotic regression session finally began, and one of the first memories that surfaced was specifically tied to a past experience with voluntary astral travel.
Okay, so under hypnosis, he recalled a specific out-of-body experience from 2014. And in this memory, he found himself partially separated from his physical body, actually able to observe himself lying in bed.
Right, which confirms that he did indeed have the ability to enter this state, at least on some occasions.
Hmm.
And what makes this particular memory so interesting is that he wasn't alone. He sensed the presence of multiple beings in the room with him.
He couldn't see them clearly, but he described them as having a generally human-like form. But then there was one being in particular who he interacted with more directly.
This being was positioned behind him, and he could feel it holding his legs energetically, not physically, but with some kind of energy. And it seemed like the purpose of this energetic holding was to prevent something from happening, almost like they were trying to stop him from doing something or going somewhere.
Spooky. And during this encounter, the name Gabriel came to Nestor to identify this being. He described Gabriel in detail, tall nude, except for a tunic, wearing Roman-style sandals with curly blonde hair and bright, almost glowing eyes that were human-like in shape, but somehow more luminous.
It's a very striking image that he conjured up. And then things got even weirder when they explored what Nestor perceived as Gabriel's DNA. Now keep in mind, we're talking about Nestor's perception within this hypnotic state. So the idea of analyzing DNA here is more symbolic. It's about understanding the fundamental nature of this being as he experienced it.
Right, it's not about literal genetics. But within the symbolic framework, Nestor perceived Gabriel's DNA as having a complete structure that contained genetic material from a whopping 23 combined species.
23. That's a lot. And to top it off, Gabriel allegedly claimed to be everything and asserted that all of Nestor's knowledge and experiences were essentially a part of him.
Everything. Talk about a grandiose claim. It definitely suggests a being of immense scope and connection, almost like they were encountering an entity claiming a very high level of existence or influence. And this encounter ultimately led to an identification of Gabriel with a very well-known figure.
Yes. Gabriel identified himself as the Archangel Gabriel and stated point blank that Nestor was under his custody. And the reason he gave: orders from above from our Father, who was then identified using names like I am, Yahweh, YHVH, names that are commonly associated with the God of Abrahamic religions.
So we have a figure of immense significance in religious traditions showing up in this regression. And the message from this Gabriel seems to outline a specific plan for humanity.
He described a plan where everyone stays within their designated patria or homeland and doesn't disrupt a pre-established order. Gabriel claimed to have known Nestor always, and somewhat surprisingly called him a worker of the light, which Nestor immediately disagreed with.
That's interesting that he had such a strong visceral reaction against that label. It highlights a real disconnect between how he sees himself and how this entity perceives him. And then Gabriel goes on to position himself in a very specific way in relation to good and evil.
He claimed to be above both light and darkness, implying a kind of transcendence beyond the usual dualities we tend to think about. But the purpose he then outlined was pretty disturbing: to control and dominate the inhabitants of Earth and potentially other places as well.
Not exactly the benevolent archangel we might expect. And he even stated that Nestor couldn't escape their control and that any attempt to do so would jeopardize this mission of domination. It paints a very different picture of this figure.
Absolutely. And the transcript also touches on why this Gabriel was even willing to answer Nestor's questions in the first place.
And the reason given is directly related to Nestor's own agency in the situation.
Exactly. Gabriel said his willingness to engage was due to Nestor's will and a pre-existing pact. It suggests that maybe on a subconscious level, Nestor agreed to this interaction, or maybe his will was strong enough to force it. So after this intense encounter, the focus shifts back to a past life memory.
Nestor is guided back to a scene in a place called Atina, which he made a point of saying was not our Earth. In this memory, he found himself on his knees, bound with a figure in Roman-like armor standing over him.
This armored figure was holding a sword and a parchment covered in writing. And he was identified as Cantorel. Cantorel accused Nestor of making past mistakes and interfering with their plan, and threatened him with banishment and imprisonment.
A pretty heavy scene of judgment and accusation, and Nestor's emotional response to this memory is really significant.
He felt an intense wave of guilt, a really powerful and pervasive emotion.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is that he was able to pinpoint where he felt this guilt in his body, specifically in his chest. This connection between emotions and their physical locations is something that's often explored in practices like hypnotherapy.
And that feeling of guilt becomes a really key point for the rest of the session. It's not just an emotion, it's described as an energy that's being used to control him.
Exactly. Yeah, it's framed as something that's being imposed upon him by these other entities, not necessarily originating from within him. And the next step is trying to release this energy.
So they work on helping Nestor consciously let go of this stored guilt, and then they dig even deeper into the origin of this feeling, eventually tracing it back to something called an implant.
An implant located in his head that was actively generating this feeling of guilt. The idea of implants, whether you take them literally or metaphorically as ingrained beliefs or patterns, is really interesting. It highlights how these deeply rooted things can feel like foreign intrusions on our autonomy.
So instead of the guilt being a natural part of him, it's like this external device was making him feel that way, and then they identify the entity supposedly responsible for this implant.
They link it back to Cantorel, that armored figure from the past life, and another being referred to as the Father, who Nestor visually associated with Zeus, the king of the Greek gods. And this father figure claimed to be the creator of all things.
So now we have what seems like a hierarchy of control with these powerful, almost mythological figures implicated in manipulating Nestor's emotions. And after this revelation, Nestor makes a very direct request.
He asks for the complete removal of all implants. And what follows is a detailed account of numerous implants being removed from all over his body.
It's an extensive list. He describes implants being removed from behind his left eye, a plate in his forehead, his ears, a capsule with screws in his pineal gland, and that's just in his head.
It goes on. He mentions a spiked chain in his throat, implants in his shoulders, a cage-like structure around his heart, a spiral ring in his stomach, capsules in his back, and even devices in his knees, ankles, feet, hands, and wrists. He even talks about patterns inscribed on his DNA that were affecting his behavior also being removed.
It's like a systematic cleansing of his entire being. And he also mentions implants in some more sensitive areas.
Yes, an implant in his genitals described as a distraction, and another one in his pelvis. Interestingly, the last implants to be removed are the ones in the back of his neck and behind his right eye. Almost like there was a specific order to it, or maybe those were seen as the most deeply embedded.
It's definitely curious. After this extensive implant removal, the session shifts to addressing Nestor's emotional state directly.
With these controlling devices supposedly removed, They focus on clearing any remaining negative emotions. Feelings of guilt in his stomach, fear in his back, and anger in his abdomen are identified, and he's guided through a process of releasing them. He's encouraged to gather up all those negative emotions and expel them from his being.
A kind of energetic and emotional detox. And then it goes beyond just clearing out the negative stuff. They start working on actively cultivating positive emotions and a more positive mental state.
Exactly. He's guided to focus on raising his vibrational frequency, a term often used in spiritual and holistic practices to refer to one's overall energetic or emotional state. And he's encouraged to cultivate feelings of happiness, relaxation, and positive energy.
So it's about shifting to a more positive outlook, but not in a forced or artificial way. It's about empowering him to consciously choose those feelings.
Right. And then to solidify this shift, he's taken back to that past life scene in Athena where he faced the armored figure.
So he's revisiting that confrontation with Cantarell, but this time things are different. He's able to observe himself as he was before, trembling, crying, feeling defeated, while Cantarell reads out the accusations. But with his cleared emotional state and the implants supposedly gone, he has a completely different experience.
Yes, he feels detached from the scene and recognizes that even Cantarell is being controlled by something larger. And then he does something incredibly powerful. He rejects the contracts and punishments that are being imposed on him and metaphorically tears up the parchment.
Talk about reclaiming your power. It's like he's breaking free from this web of control.
Yeah.
And how do the other figures react to this?
Cantarell is described as kneeling down, looking defeated and bothered by Nestor's presence, but also maybe a little relieved. The father figure, Zeus, is just sitting on his throne looking bored, seemingly unaffected by Nestor's defiance. It's like their power over him has diminished.
And finally, after this confrontation, Nestor is guided back to the present moment.
He reports feeling light-free and energized, animated but understandably tired after such an intense experience. He also expresses a desire for the session to be shared, publicly acknowledging that some of it might be controversial, but emphasizing the value of exploring these deeper realities.
Well, you, our listeners, certainly brought us some thought-provoking material today. It definitely speaks to your open-mindedness and willingness to explore the unconventional.
Absolutely. Nestor's deep dive gives us a lot to think about. We witnessed his journey to identify and release perceived constraints, both external and internal, those esoteric influences, the alleged implants, the deeply ingrained emotional and mental patterns holding him back. And whether you interpret his experiences literally or symbolically, the themes of control and liberation are incredibly powerful and relatable.
Regardless of your beliefs about hypnotic regression, the core message here is universal. Question authority, understand the many ways we can be controlled both internally and externally, and recognize our own potential for transformation and reclaiming our freedom.
So now it's your turn. What are the implants in your own life? What are the things holding you back from your full potential? It could be societal expectations, limiting beliefs, emotional baggage. Take some time to reflect on those things and remember the power you have within yourself to break free.
You have the will, and that's something worth exploring.
Absolutely.